Hello, everyone, and welcome to this continuing legal education event on the hydrogen opportunity, recent developments and incentives presented by Husch Blackwell. My name is Miguel Suazo, and I'm an attorney in Husch Blackwell's Renewable Energy Group. Before we begin, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items. At the bottom of your screen, there are multiple application icons for use during the program. If you have any questions during the webcast, please submit those via the question box. We'll be able to answer all questions during the webcast today, but if a fuller answer is needed or if we run out of time, we'll answer it at a later date. A PDF of the presentation is available in the program materials folder. This has been approved for legal education credits. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see the CEU icon, and a certificate of attendance, including course numbers, will be emailed to you tomorrow, along with a recording of the webcast for watching and sharing. At the end of the presentation, please complete a short survey. We use your feedback to plan for future programs and other needs. I'm joined by my colleagues, Mike Blackwell and Andrew Eastman. Michael is an energy attorney and focuses on matters of market design and regulation and works with a wide variety of clients. Andrew is an accomplished corporate attorney with extensive litigation experience and represents clients with a dual emphasis on commercial success and risk mitigation. I'd also like to give a special thank you to an associate of ours, McKinley Rogers, for helping us put this presentation together. So this is what we'll be covering today. As you can see, there's a lot of ground. We'll be discussing the recent developments in the US hydrogen industry and legal developments affecting those industries. Today's presentation covers three main areas. We have a background on the science of hydrogen production, as well as the technologies that support the practical industrial use of hydrogen as an energy source. We'll also explore recent legal developments, including the status of state and federal incentives for the hydrogen industry, and also give an overview of the regulatory structures that govern the hydrogen industry. We'll also focus on current trends in financing and offtake arrangements for hydrogen projects, and we'll close with our key takeaways on the future of this emerging area. So first off, why is hydrogen an opportunity? And it's an opportunity because the consumption of hydrogen does not produce carbon dioxide emissions. Hydrogen could allow us to decarbonize various industrial processes in very large sectors of the economy that are otherwise a real challenge. Think of things like long-haul trucking and iron and steel production. Hydrogen can also be used for energy storage for large mobility applications. Trucking, maritime are just some examples. And a lot of people are saying, a lot of energy experts are saying that hydrogen is essentially the second vector for decarbonization after electrification. And projections are that it will meet 13% of our energy demand by 2050, or 20% if hydrogen-based fuels are also included in that mix. So the long-term market for hydrogen is expected to be enormous, up to 2.5 trillion or more by 2050. And the announced projects for the next 5 years alone will require billions of dollars of investments in electrolyzers and renewable energy production. There's also a lot of governmental financial support in place now. We've adopted in the US a net zero by 2050 target. And just recently, the Inflation Reduction Act, or IRA, introduced a massive tax credit to make clean hydrogen using methods to minimize greenhouse gas emissions. A tax credit tucked into the IRA gives the maximum tax credit of $3 per kilogram to hydrogen produced with renewable and nuclear energy. But additional commitment is needed. Despite all these tailwinds, while interest in hydrogen is strong, a significant increase in commitments and supportive regulatory frameworks must occur. There's still significant uncertainty remaining regarding the magnitude of the investments needed in the coming decade to enable a clean hydrogen economy and contribute to the net zero emissions targets. And this kind of transition will require a lot of investment. Estimates are between $7 and $8 trillion through 2050. But by that date, we hope that the hydrogen economy will generate as much as $3 trillion of revenue. So we expect that these investments will pay off over the long run. Obviously, the key is going to be reducing costs by establishing economies of scale, building the necessary infrastructure, and ultimately making hydrogen competitive, available, and cost efficient for decarbonization purposes. So first, you may remember from grade school science that hydrogen is the first element of the periodic table. It's the lightest, consisting of 1 proton and 1 electron. The energy must be supplied either by heat or electricity. It is the most abundant chemical element in the universe. It's highly reactive and a potent carrier of energy, but it requires a lot of energy to actually create hydrogen. Hydrogen as a fuel is classified into different colors, which many of you may already be familiar with. I'm going to go over those briefly, but the color assigned to hydrogen depends on the molecule being broken down to produce it. So first we have black, brown, and gray hydrogen. Today, 95% of hydrogen produced in the US is black, brown, or gray. And this is why right now hydrogen production actually contributes to CO2 emissions globally as much as 2.2%. Black, brown, and gray hydrogen are produced from breaking down coal or natural gas, and CO2 and CO2 byproducts are usually released directly into the atmosphere as greenhouse gas emissions when this type of hydrogen is created. Next, we have blue hydrogen. It's produced using natural, it's similar to gray hydrogen, but with blue hydrogen, the CO2 is actually captured and stored. Industry has looked to blue hydrogen and turquoise hydrogen, which I'll get to, as a way to continue using natural gas as a feedstock while producing less CO2. But basically, blue hydrogen is created by creating hydrogen and carbon monoxide through a chemical reaction. Water is added to that mixture, turning the carbon monoxide into carbon dioxide and more hydrogen. If the carbon dioxide emissions are then captured and stored underground, this process is considered carbon neutral. Generally speaking, CCUS technologies, which are available today, are still largely unproven and at high capture rates not yet cost effective. But they could offer a decarbonization pathway if the technology improves. So here's turquoise, as I mentioned, is produced using natural gas as a feedstock, but there's no CO2 produced, rather a solid carbon is produced that can be disposed of or reused for things like plastic, construction materials, or tires. Next, we have pink hydrogen. A lot of proponents see this as a promising option when electricity demand is low. It uses spare nuclear capacity to produce and store hydrogen for periods of high energy demand, and it also relies on electrolyzers to convert water into oxygen and hydrogen. Next, we have green hydrogen, which is produced from renewable power, wind, solar, geothermal. It's considered the most promising of the hydrogen transition because it makes water and electricity using electrolyzers, which are essentially just applying a current to the water to split the molecule. And since the electricity source is renewable, there are no CO2 emissions. After creating the hydrogen, and regardless of the method, the hydrogen can be transported, stored, or burned. And last but not least, we have gold hydrogen. It's a new addition to the color scheme. It's in a way quasi-theoretical. Basically, quantities of hydrogen are being discovered below the Earth's surface. It's believed that this form of hydrogen is created by water seeping down, deep below the Earth's surface and reacting with rock, and essentially forming large deposits of hydrogen. We don't know how large those deposits are yet, but oil and gas production technologies are enabling us to kind of start exploring for this type of hydrogen more. So we'll keep tabs on this form of hydrogen and see how large a source it might actually be. So one thing that's important to understand is how hydrogen actually gets from maker to buyer. How does it get to market? So basically two methods. First is displacement or transportation through pipelines. The pipeline has to touch both buyer and seller, no matter what tributaries and injection or offtake points exist between them. The buyer and seller must enter into an offtake agreement, which we'll touch later in this presentation, and the buyer's input into that pipeline must match the seller's offtake. The second version is dedicated, which is a purpose-built transmission pipeline, or a virtual pipeline, which means over-the-road tanker trucking to get hydrogen from place to place. A little bit on supply and demand. Demand, it's hoped that hydrogen can be the building block of the clean energy economy, just as carbon is the building block of the industrial economy. Many are looking at hydrogen to try and understand where it fits in our modern energy scheme. Hydrogen's flexibility as a zero carbon fuel, a clean energy carrier, and a bridge to clean electricity make it the missing piece for a fully decarbonized economy. And today, just as far as, how is hydrogen used, it's basically leveraged to bond with other, to refine oil products, to bond with other elements and decontaminate the final product. And it's also used as a chemical feedstock to produce ammonia for fertilizer and other key chemicals. It's also important to think about, for purposes of supply and demand, industries of the future. What can we use hydrogen for looking forward? We can blend hydrogen with natural gas for water and space heating applications that would require little or no end-use upgrades to current appliances. We could also use pure hydrogen. However, the potential need for upgrades to infrastructure and appliances can make this a more difficult option. Hydrogen could lower emissions of residential, commercial, and industrial heating without new infrastructure. And to do that, hydrogen would be blended into the natural gas grid or using stationary fuel cells directly in buildings to generate electricity and use the heat byproduct as a replacement of traditional space and water heaters. Can be used for, can be blended into the natural gas pipelines and networks to power large commercial buildings as well. And on a smaller scale, it can be used for backup power. Stationary fuel cells can be used for that purpose. And also for transportation. Fuel cell electric vehicles, or FCEVs, have a hydrogen tank that connects to the fuel cell. And major automotive manufacturers have started planning entry into the fuel sector. For example, Hyundai has recently announced that it will manufacture 500,000 hydrogen vehicles by 2030. Hydrogen can also change existing industries. As you may be aware, steel production requires extreme temperatures and results in high CO2 emissions because it's made in a blast furnace using high carbon fuel known as coke as a fuel source. So hydrogen, because of its energy content, could be used to replace the coke that are used in these traditional furnaces. And it's estimated that going this route could reduce CO2 emissions from the steel sector by 40 to 70%, which is substantial. Hydrogen could also enable the decarbonization of current fossil fuel powered generation assets through blending of natural gas. Power systems could be decarbonized with central station gas turbines fueled by hydrogen or hydrogen carriers, such as ammonia or distributed hydrogen fuel cells, especially when other dispatchable generators face limitations or no local carbon storage exists. Hydrogen is increasingly being used for power generation through fuel cells. Fuel cells combine hydrogen and oxygen and produce electricity and release only water and heat as byproducts. And stationary fuel cells have been used to provide power off-grid areas or as backup power. And the released heat can be used to heat nearby spaces as well. Just a bit on export markets. Early growth in hydrogen will likely center in Europe, Japan, Korea, and Australia. Other nations are pretty far ahead of the US in terms of hydrogen use and production. But those four countries in Europe, 3 countries in Europe, will represent about 20% of total hydrogen demand by 2030. China and North America currently represent nearly half of gray hydrogen demand. And combined, these areas will account for more than 60% of the global hydrogen market by 2030 and 70% of global clean hydrogen demand. Demand in these countries or in other countries outside of these regions is expected to develop more slowly due to less regulation. And many of these markets are expected to be crucial in meeting hydrogen demand in hydrogen hubs such as Europe, Japan, and Korea. And there's also larger export markets that have been announced in the Middle East, Latin America, and Oceania. One thing we're still trying to figure out is how much hydrogen we'll need to supply the anticipated demand for hydrogen in a cost-optimal way. A mix of both renewable and low-carbon hydrogen supply would require about 200 to 250 gigawatts of electrolyzer capacity and 300 to 400 gigawatts of new renewables, as well as 45 to 55 megatons of low-carbon hydrogen production capacity and the associated carbon infrastructure to store 300 to 350 megatons of CO2. So this will create a need to step up the deployment of renewables. There's 260 gigawatts of capacity that's been commissioned, but as you can see, these numbers are not small. So it's going to take a lot of investment and effort to actually get this hydrogen production to the levels that we need. So that covers the background section. Recently, there's been a number of legal developments in the US for facilitating hydrogen development in the form of legislation and creating the creation of incentives and tax credits, which some of you who do energy project work are familiar with. But everyone is still working to understand how they can benefit from those incentives. And we're still waiting on guidance from the IRS and other federal agencies, which we expect to receive this year. I will go over broadly the first piece of legislation, which is the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, before I turn it back over to my colleagues. So the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or IIJA, colloquially it's known also as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. This was signed by President Biden back in 2021 in November, and it included substantial funding to encourage and accelerate research and development, demonstration and deployment of clean hydrogen in the US. The IIJA provided $9.5 billion for clean hydrogen programs and contains other initiatives for opportunities to support hydrogen energy vehicles and infrastructure. It also authorized $8 billion for regional clean hydrogen hubs. The three major clean hydrogen programs are the Regional Clean Hydrogen Hub Program, the Clean Hydrogen Electrolysis Program, and the Clean Hydrogen Manufacturing and Recycling Program. In addition, these clean hydrogen specific programs, there's numerous other programs that provide hydrogen opportunities for transportation, shipping, and electricity generation. And these programs should further investment and advancement in the deployment of hydrogen and fuel cell technologies. One thing to note about the Regional Clean Hydrogen Hub Program, it will focus on creating hubs to demonstrate the production, processing, delivery, storage, and end use of clean hydrogen. The DOE will implement and administer the program, and funds will be allocated through a grant program. These hubs are going to have three purposes. They're supposed to help achieve clean hydrogen production standard targets of 2 kilograms of CO2 per kilogram of hydrogen produced. They are to demonstrate the clean hydrogen value chain from production to end use and create the potential for a national clean hydrogen network. The Clean Hydrogen Electrolysis Program is to be a demonstration, commercialization, and deployment program to decrease the cost of production from electrolyzers. The DOE will establish and oversee the program, and there's $1 billion dedicated to this program, which will be expended through cooperative agreements. With respect to the manufacturing and recycling program, this seeks to support the domestic hydrogen supply chain by supporting projects to increase efficiency and cost effectiveness and address any hindrances to research, development, demonstration, and alternative recovery processes. So DOE will actually implement and oversee the program and is allocated $500 million, which will also be expended through grants, contracts, and cooperative agreements. So as you can see, this piece of legislation alone will have a significant impact on the development of a clean hydrogen economy in the US. And it's only one of the new laws that's intended for that purpose. So now I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Andrew Eastman, who will tell you about the Inflation Reduction Act.
Thanks, Miguel. I appreciate it. The Inflation Reduction Act, or the IRA, is something that our firm has written about extensively. It's something that's probably familiar to most people on this program, at least in passing. And the background is that in August of 2022, it was passed. And within that act is about $369 billion that's earmarked specifically for addressing climate change. The IRA is one of, if not the most significant pieces of legislation on clean energy and climate change in US history. And really, it's got an unprecedented focus on clean hydrogen. The IRA provides support for clean hydrogen and a hydrogen economy through a series of tax credits. The point of those is to encourage investment into infrastructure, production, storage, and consumption. And the IRA provides those credits and other policies really as a means of boosting clean hydrogen production. So part of that support means that it's for clean hydrogen and also for fuel cell technologies. And that's done by extending, increasing, and creating a number of new federal credits. One of those that we're going to talk about is the 45V credit. This is a clean hydrogen production tax credit, or PTC. It's a new clean hydrogen PTC created under the IRA, and it's available for qualified clean hydrogen produced at a qualifying facility during that facility's first 10 years of operation. Really, so this is meant to incentivize early stage and then get over the hump into continued operation. This PTC can be up to $3 per kilogram. This 45V credit is based, or rather calculated based on the CO2 intensity, the carbon intensity of a plant. It's got a maximum limit, meaning that intensity cannot exceed 4 kilograms of CO2 per kilogram of hydrogen. So essentially, the credit amount is going to be equal to the number of kilograms of qualified clean hydrogen produced by the taxpayer, the one who owns the facility, multiplied by the applicable credit amount, multiplied again by the applicable rate, depending on the project's CI score. What that means financing-wise is that projects who are going to be financed, at least in part by the assumption of winning these credits or this particular credit, are going to have to engage early with really a qualified CI modeler during early design and engineering phases. So like other IRA credits that are familiar to renewable natural gas developers, for example, the 45V credit is going to increase a number of times, in this case 5x, from the base credit if you can meet certain adder criteria. One of those is a wage and workforce requirement, essentially paying prevailing wage and offering a qualified apprenticeship program. There's guidance on that forthcoming from Treasury, but we do have some guidance presently. And we feel that historic guidance on similar credits is a pretty good roadmap for how to qualify for those things, which basically means to qualify at the base rate, construction is going to have to start before January 1 of this year, or have to have started. That said, retrofit facilities are going to be eligible to qualify, and they're going to qualify based on the date that the retrofit modifications are placed in service. And those have got to be modifications that are meant and are necessary to clean hydrogen production. So calculating the placed in service dates, as well as the begun construction dates, are another one of those items that probably is going to be subject to future guidance from Treasury and from the IRS. But we know a pretty good amount already based on what's come out to date. And we can make a pretty well-educated guess based on historic guidance as to how to meet things like placed in service and begun construction. So taxpayers, those who own and develop these facilities, can elect to claim either the PTC for electricity produced from renewable sources, if that electricity is used at a qualified clean hydrogen facility to produce clean hydrogen, meaning not only can you claim this clean hydrogen PTC, but there's also the potential to claim an additional and separate PTC for the energy, the electricity that goes into that production process. The other credit relevant to hydrogen production that came out of the IRA is the Section 48 credit. That one is codified at Section 48A15 of the Revenue Code. And that one is an ITC as opposed to a PTC, meaning it's an investment tax credit, not a production tax credit. What that lets taxpayers do is treat specified clean hydrogen production facilities as energy property. And that's energy property with respect to which they'll be entitled to claim an investment tax credit. So that tax credit for any taxable year is going to equal the energy percentage of the basis of that production facility that's placed in service during that year. And so, we expect to get into sort of parsing what it means to place a facility in service. Generally, without getting into more detail than is intended for this particular webinar, there are 5 factors that we'll look at for placed in service. They've been set out by the IRS, and they've been confirmed in a number of appellate decisions. And those are 5 factors that we're pretty confident and that accounting firms become pretty confident in using to determine whether a project has or has not been placed in service by any particular date. No one of those factors is dispositive. It's a balancing test, but there are a couple of more material factors that weigh more heavily than others. So this 48 ITC, the Section 48 ITC investment tax credit, is also available for energy storage technology, not just production, which means property. And there are some carve-outs, but generally speaking, property that receives, stores, and delivers energy for eventual conversion to electricity. Or in the case of a hydrogen plant that stores that energy and that's got a nameplate capacity of at least 5 kilowatt hours. So what this means, sort of practically speaking, is that standalone hydrogen storage technology is also eligible for the Section 48 ITC, plus the corresponding wage apprenticeship bonus multiplier. There is a domestic content multiplier as well. And there are some other multipliers if things are located, for example, in energy communities, which are defined a certain way within the IRA. So those adders are might sound familiar if you've worked through those in the context of a biogas project or other energy project. Those are going to apply to the hydrogen ITC and PTC as well. The ITC with respect to hydrogen, Section 48, is determined on what you can think of as sort of a sliding scale of greenhouse gas emissions, meaning you're going to look at the greenhouse gas emissions attributable to a hydrogen production facility and determine whether those equal the energy percentage of the basis of that eligible facility during a taxable year as a way of calculating the value. And so, like other ITCs, and again, this is falls in that great category of guidance forthcoming, but there are direct pay and transfer options on the table. How those can be effectuated and monetized, TBD, but those would really make monetizing these credits a lot faster and simpler and more efficient and cheaper without having to go through a traditional tax equity financing transaction that tends to be costly and burdensome. This new PTC, the production tax credit, along with the ITC, but especially the PTC, is expected to really provide an immediate incentive to increase hydrogen production. Why? Because it's money that you get for producing, as opposed to at the end of the year that you can claim as an ITC. It's the most immediate near-term credit. So indirectly, in addition to that direct benefit, the IRA also incentivizes clean energy generation in forms other than hydrogen, which a lot of analysts and those who watch the industry think is going to have a downstream benefit for clean hydrogen. Basically, the increased production of clean hydrogen feedstock. So the more clean energy of other forms that's produced, the more clean feedstock there will be for clean hydrogen. Presently, about 48% of hydrogen, I think Miguel mentioned or alluded to, is made using natural gas. That natural gas can be replaced without batting an eye by renewable natural gas or biogas in the production process, and thereby lower the carbon intensity and the emissions of the hydrogen that's being produced. So the IRA would also indirectly stimulate the hydrogen industry by generating demand. Specifically, it contains a number of incentives for clean energy technologies and clean transportation fuels that are going to increase demand for those things because people will be looking to claim and monetize and trade those incentives. Those incentives are going to lead to increased offtake demand for clean hydrogen. If you can use clean hydrogen to make or generate some of these things that create these incentives or that make your project eligible to claim these incentives and monetize them in a way that's permissible, then you're going to need feedstock to do that, which may well be clean hydrogen. That's going to be especially apparent probably in the context of sustainable aviation fuel and also low emission vehicle fuel cells. Um, Finally, what we expect this credit to do is really ultimately make it more economically feasible to develop and build and operate these projects, but also to use carbon capture and storage technology in conjunction with them to reduce carbon emissions. There are CCUS credits available in the IRA as well that sort of work in conjunction with the other IRA, rather the other ITC and PTC. Essentially, these things all are part of the capital stack for any prospective hydrogen project. The IRA likely is also going to open the door for a range of companies looking for cleaner ways to make hydrogen and to use hydrogen as a replacement for fossil fuels in certain areas. So that said, let me turn it back to Mike Blackwell now, who's going to cover government implementation and also regulation of these emerging technologies.
All right. Thanks, Andrew. I'm going to cover three main topics. The first one is I will discuss efforts by the DOE to encourage and implement the emerging hydrogen industry. Second, I'm going to summarize regulations that currently govern the hydrogen industry. And finally, I'll provide an overview of what legislation and regulations are being advanced among the U.S. states. The DOE plays a critical central role in advancing the potential growth of hydrogen industries. In fact, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which I'll refer to as the IIJA, specifically directs the DOE to allocate funding for hydrogen industry development and prepare strategies and plans for U.S. adoption of clean hydrogen technologies. As we heard earlier from Miguel, the IIJA imposes obligations on the DOE to oversee funding and implementation of programs related to hydrogen. Specifically, the IIJA authorizes funding for research, development, demonstration, and deployment of clean hydrogen technologies, requires the DOE to prioritize funding for low-carbon hydrogen, requires cost sharing for hydrogen research and development projects, and requires the DOE to report annually to Congress on the progress of hydrogen activities, including the allocation of funding and progress on funded projects. In response to the IIJA directives, in 2022, the DOE published a draft National Clean Hydrogen Strategy and Roadmap, identifying strategic opportunities that would allow the U.S. to achieve significantly increased commercial deployment of clean hydrogen in the coming decades. As of March of this year, the final version of the roadmap has not been released, but the DOE has indicated that the final version will be released in the near future, so stay tuned. While many of the DOE's activities are derived from the directives set forth in the IIJA, some efforts were underway prior to its enactment. For example, the Hydrogen Energy Earthshot program was announced by the DOE in June of 2021. Its goal is to reduce the cost of clean hydrogen by 80% to $1 per kilogram by 2031 and make hydrogen competitive with traditional fossil fuel sources of energy. The initiative is modeled after the Apollo program from the 1960s. The Earthshot program aims to mobilize a broad coalition of stakeholders, including industry, academia, government, and civil society, to collaborate and accelerate hydrogen technologies. Also, the DOE's Clean Hydrogen Technology Initiative was launched by the DOE in February of last year. The initiative aims to accelerate the development and deployment of clean hydrogen tech, which are critical for achieving the Biden administration's goal of net zero emissions by 2050. While the Clean Hydrogen Technology Initiative is not required under the IIJA, it is consistent with its broader goals to promote clean energy and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So that was a quick overview of what the DOE is doing to implement new hydrogen industry here in the U.S. Let me move on and talk with you for a bit about what regulations currently exist to govern the existing hydrogen industry in the United States and identify some of the gaps and uncertainties that will be important for policymakers to consider in the years to come. At present, the United States lacks a comprehensive federal regulation governing the use of hydrogen. Several federal agencies do possess authority by virtue of their regulatory jurisdiction over conventional energy sources to regulate hydrogen at different stages of its life cycle. Now, let me introduce these regulatory frameworks in a bit more detail. First, let's talk about production. Hydrogen production in the United States is regulated by several agencies, depending on the method of production and the types of facilities involved. For large-scale hydrogen production, the primary federal agency responsible for regulation today is the Environmental Protection Agency. The EPA regulates hydrogen production. Excuse me, I needed to advance the slide. The EPA regulates hydrogen production facilities under the Clean Air Act, which sets emission standards for stationary sources of air pollution, including hydrogen production plants. The EPA's national emission standards for hazardous air pollutants, or NESHAP, also applies, as well as the EPA's mandatory greenhouse gas reporting program, the effluent standards under the Clean Water Act, and the Chemical Accident Prevention Program. Under the reporting program and effluent standards, hydrogen is merely regulated as an offshoot of fossil fuel regulation, rather than standing alone in its own class. Specifically, the regulatory scope is confined to hydrogen produced as a byproduct of traditional fossil fuel production, such as gray hydrogen produced via feedstock and as a refinery byproduct. So, as production begins to shift away from traditional fossil fuels towards cleaner energy sources, these sources of regulatory authority will no longer be appropriate, driving the need for updated, tailored federal regulatory power. Finally, industry standards and best practices also play a role in regulating hydrogen production. I've listed a few of those here on the slide. Regarding safety regulation, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or OSHA, regulates worker safety under the Occupational Safety and Health Act, which sets standards for workplace safety, including chemical hazards. At present, the pipeline transportation safety aspects of the hydrogen industry are primarily regulated by the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, or PHMSA. We'll talk more about PHMSA when we discuss interstate shipping in a bit. Hydrogen storage is also regulated. OSHA is again the primary federal regulator for hydrogen storage, prescribing standards for storage location, testing, supervision, and ventilation. Additionally, other sections of OSHA regulations not specifically intended to contemplate hydrogen may still be used to regulate hydrogen, such as standards for liquefied and compressed gases. All right, let's talk about licensing. In the world of natural gas, firms that provide gas supply services in a competitive energy market are generally required to hold a license before performing supply services. Natural gas suppliers are typically federally regulated by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC. But for hydrogen, the United States currently has no federal licensing scheme governing the production, transportation, or sale of hydrogen. Likewise with trading. As the hydrogen economy expands, we can expect to see a hydrogen trading market emerge. But so far, the industry is too nascent to support a liquid regional or national market. So as you might expect, there are currently not any comprehensive regulations or rules governing hydrogen trading. All right, let's next talk about the regulation of interstate shipping of hydrogen. Now, this is an important and dynamic area of the law right now, considering that existing hydrogen transportation infrastructure is a critical limiting factor on the future viability of the industry. As demand for interstate hydrogen shipping evolves, the regulatory framework will be important for lawmakers to get right. Let's start by talking about pipelines. Currently, there are only 1,600 miles of closed network dedicated hydrogen pipelines in the United States. The existing hydrogen pipelines are closed network, with transactions based on bilateral agreements between a small number of participants. Ultimately, a vastly more expansive pipeline system is needed if the hydrogen industry is to become a widespread component of the U.S. energy economy, akin to that of the more than 2 million miles of natural gas pipeline in the United States today. The primary federal agency responsible for regulating hydrogen pipeline transportation is, again, PHMSA. PHMSA regulates hydrogen pipeline transportation pursuant to the pipeline safety regulations. PHMSA also regulates transportation of hydrogen in cylinders and other containers under the hazardous materials regulations. Because these minimum standards only contemplate the small-scale hydrogen use or the regulations of compressed gases, PHMSA has been conducting research to inform the updating of these standards to enable commercial-scale transportation of hydrogen. Thus, it is likely that a commercial-scale hydrogen transportation and deployment become more prevalent. PHMSA will update its standards and regulations to address the chemical risks associated with hydrogen transportation. Rate regulation in interstate shipping will be an essential aspect as the hydrogen economy expands. A common question is whether FERC currently regulates hydrogen shipping by pipeline, like it does for natural gas and oil. The answer is no, at least not currently. FERC's authority is limited to the regulation of transmission and sale of natural gas, oil, and electricity in interstate commerce, as well as the construction and operation of interstate natural gas pipelines and storage facilities. However, FERC has expressed interest in developing regulatory frameworks that accommodate the transportation and storage of hydrogen through pipelines. In September of 2021, FERC issued a notice of inquiry seeking public comment on the potential regulatory, policy, and logistical challenges. FERC is also participating in the Interagency Working Group on Hydrogen Pipeline Infrastructure, which is working to identify regulatory and technical barriers to hydrogen pipeline development and to deploy solutions to overcome those barriers. So, while FERC does not currently have regulatory authority over hydrogen pipelines, it is actively exploring ways to accommodate hydrogen transport within its existing regulatory framework. Efforts are underway in U.S. Congress to explore reformation of these regulatory frameworks. The U.S. Senate Committee on Energy and Natural Resources held a hearing in the summer of 2022 to explore the potential for revising the statutes regulating hydrogen. The existing statutes under consideration are the Natural Gas Act, the Interstate Commerce Act, and possibly the Interstate Commerce Commission's Termination Act. Also, developers and potential shippers on hydrogen pipelines should be mindful of applicable state law that pertains to regulation of hydrogen transport and common law considerations. Slightly more than half of all current hydrogen pipeline miles are located entirely within Texas. So we view Texas as an example of a state with a fairly advanced regulatory structure for hydrogen shipping. The Texas Natural Resource Code specifically lists hydrogen pipelines as possible common carriers. Common carriers in Texas are regulated by the state's Railroad Commission. For pipeline developers, common carriers or utility status can be critical in obtaining eminent domain powers for siting pipelines. Well, that's a quick overview of the current pipeline regulations. In the interest of time, I'm going to keep my comments fairly brief on roadway and railway regulation, but we're always glad to follow up after the presentation ends if you have any questions. And I know that there are some questions being populated into the chat, which is great. We'll answer if we have time, at least during the call we'll answer, and if not, we'll answer after the call with a follow-up. With regard to roadways, PHMSA sets regulations for the safe transportation of hazardous materials, including hydrogen, under the Hazardous Materials Transportation Act and the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations. Regarding economic regulation, the Surface Transportation Board is an independent federal agency that is responsible for the economic regulation of certain modes of transportation, including railroads. While the STB does not have a specific mandate to regulate hydrogen transportation, it does regulate hydrogen transportation rates, service, and competition by virtue of its authority under the Interstate Commerce Act and the Interstate Commerce Commission Termination Act. As hydrogen transportation becomes more widespread, the STB may need to develop specific rules or guidelines related to the transportation of hydrogen by rail. But for now, the STB's existing regulatory authority is sufficient to oversee the transportation of hydrogen by rail and to ensure that it is safe, efficient, and economically viable. All right. Before I turn it back over to Andrew, I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about the legislative and regulatory activity that's taking place at the state level with regard to hydrogen industry development. Let me give you a few examples of the type of legislation that states are passing that impact hydrogen industry developments. California has been a leader in promoting hydrogen as a clean energy source and has established several regulations related to hydrogen production and transportation. The California Air Resources Board, or CARB, has adopted regulations for hydrogen refueling stations, hydrogen fuel quality, and the Low Carbon Fuel Standard Program, which includes provisions for hydrogen production and use. In New York, in December of 2020, the state enacted the New York State Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which requires the state to achieve 100% zero emissions electricity by 2040 and net zero emissions across all sectors by 2050. The law also includes provisions for the development of a statewide clean fuel standard that may include hydrogen. In Hawaii, in 2019, the state passed Act 89, which established a green energy money saver program to provide rebates for the purchase or lease of hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. The program is funded by the state's fuel tax on gasoline and diesel and is intended to promote the use of zero-emission vehicles in the state. In 2021, Connecticut passed Public Act 21-191, which established a statewide green hydrogen pilot program to promote the use of green hydrogen in the transportation, industrial, and power sectors. The law also requires the state to study the feasibility of establishing a green hydrogen production facility in Connecticut. In 2021, Massachusetts passed an act creating a next-generation roadmap for Massachusetts climate policy, which sets a goal of net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 and includes provisions for the development of a clean energy standard that may include hydrogen. States are also taking action to respond to the DOE's call for bids to create regional clean hydrogen hubs, which Miguel referred to earlier. This is a part of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. These hubs can be local, statewide, or multi-state initiatives. A hydrogen hub is a geographic area designed by the Secretary of Energy. The Secretary will select at least 2 and up to 4 hydrogen hubs through a competitive process. Each hydrogen hub is expected to leverage public and private investment to build out the necessary infrastructure and facilities to support the production and distribution of clean hydrogen fuel. The IIJA and the hubs competition have led state lawmakers to propose legislation that would bolster their chances of being chosen for one of the hubs. A noteworthy example is Nebraska. In Nebraska, Legislative Bill 565 has been filed with the intention of making the state more competitive for designation as a hub location. If passed, significant state funds would be appropriated to provide grants to be used for engineering and modeling work to prepare and support the state in hub competition. In addition to individual state action, there have been multi-state collaborations on hubs throughout the U.S. Out of the 33 DOE-encouraged applicants, 13 were multi-state hubs. Well, I think that does it for me with the overview on regulatory and state legislative activity. Now I'm going to pass it over to Andrew to talk about how these projects are being financed.
Thanks, Mike. I appreciate it. Knowing those programs are out there and exist and are developing leads us pretty well into financing matters. Hydrogen, because it's sort of a new and maturing industry, or at least on a commercial scale is still maturing, means that financing vehicles have yet to be really standardized. That said, we can look to other green energy technologies that were previously emerging and are more mature now as precedent for what some of these financing methods are going to look like. It's worth noting at the outset that of the money and incentives that have been earmarked for clean hydrogen production and infrastructure. As of late 2021, only about $20 billion, which I say only because it's about 13% of that total pie, had passed a final investment decision phase. About another $64 billion, or about 40%, were in the front-end engineering to design phase. So we've got about another $160 billion, or about 25%, pending out of about $700 billion that's earmarked or set aside or created in the form of incentives and benefits that's got to be spent. And it's got to be spent to achieve the deployment that's laid out in the administration's agenda and in some of these federal and state level programs. Meaning, if you put those numbers together, there's about $300 billion that's got to be spent on production, hydrogen, about $200 billion on infrastructure, and about $200 billion on hydrogen end uses. So where that leaves us is with a gap of about $540 billion. Certainly that's a significant level. Looking at other green energy technologies, when they were where hydrogen is now, and looking at the investment that was put into them very quickly as they grew and that helped them grow, that $540 billion number really shrinks pretty quickly. I'll give you an example. That $700 billion that's going to be required is just about 1/3 of investments made in renewable energy from 2010 through 2019. It's a figure that's less than 15% even of cumulative investments in upstream oil and gas during that same time. And hydrogen investment is sort of expected to grow along that same trajectory, if not faster. Because though hydrogen financing hasn't been sort of set in stone in traditional go-to kind of off-the-shelf ways as it has been for other types of energy projects, what we can do is look to those other forms for examples of financing. Probably natural gas, biogas, renewable natural gas are going to be the closest examples. And so looking at those as precedent, we can probably expect to see hydrogen projects getting financed through traditional project finance, lending investment at either a project level, portfolio level, or parent level. Department of Energy-backed clean hydrogen loans are going to be part of that capital stack. Equity investment is going to be part of that stack. Tax equity deals involving the IRA credits, ITCs and PTCs are going to be part of that stack, and some combination of all of the foregoing. Looking at things like specifically biogas as an example, those joint ventures are probably going to pull ahead early on as a preferred financing vehicle. Originally, we expect to see those, or rather at the outset, we expect to see those as joint ventures between developers and industry stakeholders, those who have a use for hydrogen themselves, who use it in their own processes, or use it for combustion to make energy. As the market matures, we would expect to see those joint ventures sort of expand and be between developers and economic investors, not necessarily industry participants, but those who just have an interest in the economics of the hydrogen market. And that's especially going to involve economic investors who are interested in some of these rich credits, ITCs and PTCs available, and especially more so as those things can be multiplied by the adders available through wage and workforce requirements, domestic content requirements, and energy community requirements. So that takes us up really to offtake agreements, which are sort of the cornerstone of any kind of financing arrangement. The reason is that any financing party, be it lender, investor, joint venture partner, or other, wants to see that you, as a developer, have got a market for your product. Somebody's going to pay you for it. And what are they going to pay you for it? That's how you de-risk the project. That's how you make an investor or a lender or other financing party comfortable with making that financing. So there are some aspects of offtake agreements that are going to be most appealing to financing parties, that are going to make a hydrogen project most financeable. And these offtake agreements are going to be either for the actual hydrogen molecules, for the green attributes associated with them, for the tax credits generated by hydrogen production facilities, or in most cases, probably in the early days, for all three. Buying all three together is going to be an option that probably expands as demand increases. Right now, industrial applications make up just about all the demand for hydrogen. By about 2050, that number is going to drop probably to about 15%. Hydrogen buyers are going to be those who don't necessarily use it for their own purposes, but are interested more in the economics. And so what all of that is to say is that a financing party, lender, investor, joint venture partner, tax equity buyer, whatever it might be, is going to be looking for a solid offtake agreement. Most times that means long-term, fixed price. It's something that lasts long enough to make a project economic. You can make back the money put in plus an agreeable return. It's going to be fixed price. It's not going to fluctuate based on market conditions. Otherwise, you've got an awfully lumpy looking model. It's probably going to be entered into, if every financing party has its way, on a take or pay basis. The buyer's got an obligation to either receive X amount, or if they fail to receive X amount, to still pay for X amount. There's probably going to be a purchase price escalation. This is a common feature of any natural gas offtake agreement, especially in the biogas setting. That purchase price escalation is either a negotiated formula or it's tied to some sort of agreed index. Often CPI, the Consumer Price Index, is used. Sellers are going to be looking for force majeure protections having to do with the underlying project. If something happens to the plant and seller's unable to deliver whatever the minimum volume obligation might be. And looking for force majeure protections as well with respect to a failure to deliver caused by any interruption in a transmission line. Whether it's a primary or secondary means of transmission, a pipeline is curtailed, interrupted, damaged, taken out of service, whatever. And for that reason, hydrogen can't get to the buyer. Sellers will be looking for some protection there. Both sides, historically speaking, are going to look for liquidated damages, either failure to deliver or failure to purchase. Both common in market. And on the financing party side, LDs for failure to purchase are going to be one of the things that makes the project most financeable. So those are things we expect to see in an offtake agreement. We expect to see offtake agreements sort of forming one of the initial diligence considerations in any sort of financing relationship. Really, knowing that as hydrogen matures as a fuel, as a source of energy, as a market, there's going to be increased demand. A lot of these incentives and programs we've talked about are going to drive that increased demand. As demand goes up, price is going to go up. And so what we expect to see in the early days of offtake contracting is an acknowledgement on the seller side that locking in a lot of volumes now is probably going to be the best and cheapest that's going to be possible. And so we expect that to drive demand for gas, knowing what's most likely coming down the pike. And so we expect that to drive long-term fixed price structures. And we expect sellers to be able to sort of lean on that leverage a bit to get things like purchase price escalations. So that said, let me turn it back to Miguel now for some final takeaways and also closing remarks.
Thanks, Andrew. So as you all can see, the hydrogen economy is poised for considerable near and even long-term growth. Demand's expected to grow significantly as existing and new hydrogen markets mature. There are state and federal funding opportunities that will spur development, and we expect those to increase and to continue. But there are still major hurdles and challenges. There's limited infrastructure. There's the need for scaling to overcome the considerable cost of hydrogen production. And there's also still a need for greater regulatory clarity and alignment across the nation. So those will all take time to develop. We really appreciate you joining us today. We hope this information was useful for you and your organization. As a reminder, this program has been approved for legal education hours. To report your hours, click on the CEU icon at the bottom of the screen. A certificate of attendance, including course numbers, will be emailed to you tomorrow, along with a recording of the webcast for watching and sharing. Also, please be sure to complete our short survey. We use your feedback to plan future programs. This concludes our webinar. We will answer any questions that come in after the program since we are at time. Thank you again for joining us.